This screencast is about photography, and it's meant for an amateur or someone who has a digital camera and doesn't really know what all the buttons and dials and icons mean. In no way will this be exhaustive or thorough, but at least maybe we can get you up and running with a few new tips and ideas about things to look for when you're making photographs. So the first thing that I usually ask students who are new to photography is to explain to me what happens when you take a picture with your camera. And not too surprisingly, I guess, most of the time I'm kind of just in a stare-down contest with 20 students who have never been asked to articulate that mechanical process before. I think a lot of people just say, well, I just press the button, right, and I get an image. So just to sort of think a little more thoroughly about what happens when you take a picture, the first thing is you are creating a composition. So when you look through your viewfinder and you are framing the picture, you should be thinking about the four edges at the side of that frame and everything that happens between those edges and at those edges. So we're still thinking about a compositional space. This is still a design process, but instead of maybe thinking about 2D design or vector art or graphics where you're working with a blank canvas, this time the world is your canvas, and the viewfinder allows you to select a portion of the world that you present as a framed composition. Now I'm kind of skipping a bunch of things that might happen between framing the composition and pressing the shutter release, but just to be quick about things, let's say then you press the shutter release button. The shutter release button then triggers the aperture to open, and the aperture on your camera will open and close according to two things. One, the f-stop settings, so how wide it opens will be determined by the f-stop settings on your camera, and then how quickly it closes will be determined by the shutter speed. Now when the aperture is opened, light is then recorded on the digital sensor, and that light, that amount of light, is going to affect what the image looks like. Finally, the aperture closes. This is where that shutter speed comes into play. So if your shutter speed is set at a very quick amount of time, it will make a very an image where it seems like everything is frozen in time. Or if you have a slower shutter speed, like in this image, then you may see some movement. If you're using a digital camera, then the photo is saved to the memory card, and perhaps you can then view your image on the LCD sensor screen. Now, keeping all of that in mind, there are some choices that you should make before pressing the shutter release button. So, starting in the menu area, most cameras are going to have a menu area, or maybe it might be called program or function or something like that. And in this area, you should be able to make some choices. Now, I know that all cameras are not the same, and some cameras may have, you may have more choices than others, but most of the time you will be able to set either the compression or the file format, or maybe just picking something like a large file size or a medium file size or a small file size. And then you also may have access to white balance. These are just some simple choices that you can make, but they will greatly affect the outcome of your photography session. So when looking at compression, something like a digital SLR is going to allow you to save with no compression at all, meaning that it will be in raw file format, or with minimal compression. Maybe you would choose something like TIFF format for minimal compression, or if you have a choice, then you might also have JPEG compression, which is going to be a lot of compression and the smallest file format. If you're trying to make the let's say best sort of interrupted or distorted or noisy images that you could make, then you would choose the less amount of compression, the least amount of compression. So you might choose raw mode, or you might choose TIFF compressor. If you want to save the most amount of files, you'll choose a greater compressor, and then you'll have smaller file sizes, and then you'll be able to save more files. So you might choose JPEG as your compressor or your file format. In terms of image size, you may have specific resolution choices. You may have choices in terms of how large the file size is in megabytes. You may just be able to choose small, medium, or large. If you're shooting photographs for an assignment, like a class assignment, then I would shoot at the largest, probably the largest possible size. If you have a really nice kind of expensive digital SLR camera, maybe you only need to shoot on medium because, maybe we don't need the largest file sizes that you can get there. But I would avoid shooting in the smaller range because you probably want to be able to print your images. And you should also have a white balance option in there. A lot of cameras may just have something, you may only have auto, you may not have a choice, or you may be able to choose white balance for daylight or for tungsten light. So there might be a little icon of a light bulb for tungsten light or sunshine for daylight, something like that. You may have something a little more extravagant, like you might be able to set your white balance by actually taking a picture of something white or of something gray. So depending on your camera, these features are going to behave a little differently, and you should consult your manual, which if you've lost it can probably be found online, to really get to know how these features work. It's really a good idea to set your white balance. If you shoot outside and you leave your white balance accidentally on the tungsten mode or the little light bulb mode, then you're going to end up with some images that have a color cast that does not really demonstrate the true nature of the color that you were trying to capture, or the light and the color that you were trying to capture. I don't usually have to say this, but just in case, if you do have something like a date and time stamp, you should probably turn that off. Okay, you also may have ISO rating. Now this idea of film speed is kind of an older analog idea. In the days of film, which it's funny to sort of say it that way, but in the days of film, film came in different speeds, meaning you could purchase film that had either more or less silver in it. And the silver is basically the agent that would react to the chemicals and that would capture the light. So the more silver you had in your film, the less light you needed, and the more grainy your prints would look when you would develop your film and print them out, print out the pictures. We still have this idea of speed, an ISO rating and a film speed, and also the granular effect that comes with that in digital photography and in our cameras. So you may be able to set the ISO rating of your camera. Again, this probably will be a menu item. And a lot of cameras will have a range from like 100 to 1600. 100 is definitely the low end. In the days of film, you could even buy like a Kodak 25 speed film, which would have like very little grain. You would need, probably supplementary lights. You'd need a lot of light to shoot on that 25 speed film, but you would have really crisp prints that had sharp details and, very little film grain, if any, on display. So in your digital camera, you probably will want to shoot at that lower film speed, like ISO 100. That means that you'll need a significant amount of light while you're shooting, but it also means that you will not see the graininess or the noise quality, or maybe we should say the pixelization that you would see if, for instance, you were accidentally shooting at ISO 1600. So just be aware of that and make that choice before you start to shoot. If you're going to go shoot outside in the afternoon daylight, you do not need ISO 1600, and you will be probably sad to see the noisy results of that ISO rating should you accidentally leave your setting like that. I usually just leave mine at 100 and tend not to really think about it unless I purposefully need to make a choice to sort of increase that. Now, outside of those different menu items, we should also consider what happens on the camera itself before you take the picture. So there are two kind of main areas that you should be aware of, and again, not all cameras are going to allow you to change these settings. Some cameras are going to have some of these features, but they will have them in limited capacities, and that's okay. You should just sort of know what you're dealing with. So the two things that I will talk about now are shutter speed and aperture, or your f-stop. So the first thing is your shutter speed. The shutter speed is how quickly or how slowly the shutter opens and closes. And I'm sorry, the shutter is set so the aperture opens and closes. So if you have a fast shutter speed, like the image on the left was shot at 1/1000th of a second, you will capture movement as if the subject is frozen in time, right? So in that left image of the roller blader, I don't know if that's rollerblading or roller skating, I think it's rollerblading, the person is sort of stopped in time. On the right side, we see a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second, which is much slower than 1/1000th of a second. And at 1/25th of a second, we see the movement of the skater. So you will want to think about whether or not you want to show movement, how important movement is to the concept of the image. And then, of course, you'll also need to think about how much available light you have. The shutter speed is a choice that is completely connected to the aperture. So how quickly the aperture opens and closes, that's one light setting. If the aperture opens and closes very, very quickly, then we need to have a wider aperture, which is going to allow more light to come in during that quick burst. So you can see that not only do we have the shutter speeds here, 1/1000th of a second, let's use that there, and 1/25th of a second here, but notice that next to those numbers we also have the f-stop, f22 on the shutter speed that opened in, the aperture that opened and closed very slowly, and f5 on the aperture that opened and closed very quickly. This may be a little bit confusing, but the smaller the aperture number, right there, f5, the larger the aperture opening. So the more light will come in. Okay, so the smaller the aperture, the more light is going to come in. Now there's another thing that happens with that aperture, and that's called depth of field. So the smaller the number, the wider the aperture, the more light comes in, and the more blur we're going to see, or I should say the shallower the depth of field. So in this image we have the boy here in focus, the dog definitely a little bit out of focus, the slide and playset back here very much out of focus, right? So this is a relatively shallow depth of field. This was an image that I found on Flickr, thank you to dview.us. And here we also have a very shallow depth of field, right, where the garlic is in focus and the chef is very much blurred. So if you can open your aperture wide, you will get this ability to have a focal point with a sort of blurry context or blurry surrounding due to a shallow depth of field. Of course, aperture, if you set the aperture to a smaller opening, if I go back a couple slides to that f22, for instance, we're going to see everything in focus, right? So we don't have that shallow depth of field. We have basically, the whole frame is going to be in focus at that higher number or that smaller aperture opening. Now, I'm going to pause on this thank you screen to acknowledge the people who've lent me their images, some of my former students, and then some of the users who, or I should say photographers who publish their images to Flickr.com and use the Creative Commons license. That's really nice for people like me to be able to use their images and work like this. I just want to mention that your camera may have manual mode, whereby you can use the light meter inside the camera to determine how the shutter speed and aperture will need to relate to one another in any given lighting situation. Or you may not have manual mode. A lot of these sort of just prosumer, not even prosumer, like just consumer cameras won't necessarily have manual mode, but they will have shutter speed priority or aperture priority. So look in your camera, look in your manual. You may, even though perhaps you've never done it before, and maybe maybe you've avoided it, or maybe you just didn't know about it, you may be able to go ahead and shoot in shutter speed priority or an aperture priority in such a way that you can set the shutter speed to a low setting to see that movement. If you're in shutter speed priority, you choose the shutter speed and the camera will compensate for you in terms of the aperture. In other words, you don't have to use the light meter, you just make your choice and the camera will set the aperture to whatever it is that will compensate for the shutter speed that you've selected. Remember that if you're going to use a low shutter speed, that means you're going to leave the aperture open for a longer time, so you don't need quite as much light. If you use a high shutter speed, the opposite, you need a lot of light. You also may have aperture priority, so you may be able to choose a low number, meaning shallow depth of field, and again, meaning that a lot of light will be coming in, so you don't need a whole lot of light. These are all relative terms what I'm talking about, but you'll see when you get out there and start shooting. And then the shutter speed, if you're an aperture priority, the shutter speed will be selected for you. Your camera might not say S for shutter speed priority or A for aperture priority. It may have an icon that it uses instead. So you may need to consult your manual, but take a look for some of these different features. It's really a whole different world to work with your camera when you have a little more control over how you are setting up the photographs.